This meeting is being recorded, and the Metropolitan Area Planning Council may choose to retain and distribute the video, still images, audio, and/or the chat transcript. By continuing with this virtual meeting, you are consenting to participate in a recorded event. The recordings and chat transcripts will be considered a public record. If you do not feel comfortable being recorded, please turn off your camera and/or mute your microphone or leave the meeting. So I'd like to welcome everyone again. This is our second public meeting for the West Station Area Transit Study. My name is Travis Pollock. We hope you're all doing safe and you're doing well. I'd like to note that, again, everyone is muted, and for the purposes of this meeting, if you have any questions, we suggest that you enter them into the chat room. The chat, you can, I believe you can see it by, if you put your mouse over the bar where for the Zoom, over the three dots, and it says chat, you can enter the questions there, and we'll be monitoring the chat to look for questions, and if we have time, we'll get to some of them. So the agenda for today, I want to note this is the first time, first of all, that we're doing a public meeting via Zoom with breakout rooms. So I ask for your patience. I hope this will work out for everyone, but there'll be a little bit of pause here and there as we maybe share screens and do some things. So I just have to ask for people's patience. And thanks for joining us. So what we have is we're going to talk about what we've been up to. We're going to talk about the model that we're using for the West Station Area Transit Study and look at and how we're using it for scenario planning. And then the main part of our meeting will be the breakout rooms, where we want your input on what we should be testing for our scenarios in terms of destinations and transit services and connections, ped and bike connections, as well as land use policies. If there's time, we'll do some report out and feedback, and then we'll talk about what's next for our study. So what we would like to get out of this meeting today is we want to update you on what we've been working on since November and on the model. We want your input on the key connections, options, and land use scenarios that we should be testing as part of our scenario testing. And then we'll talk to you about how we're going to use this information for the rest of our study. So joining me today is a lot of MAPC staff to make this happen. Tim Reardon, who will be helping us on this, he'll talk about the modeling. I'd like to also recognize the other staff that are here with us, Eric, Yolando, Connor, Elise, Annabelle, Mara, Ty, who's our IT person to make sure things go smoothly, Alyssa, Sarah, Caitlin, Ryan, Sarah, Allison, and David. They're all going to be helping us today with the presentation or the breakout groups today. So first, we're going to be doing a poll. The Metropolitan Planning Council, we're committed to holding meetings that are diverse and as the Greater Boston region. So to help us track doing this, we'd like you to tell us about yourself. So I'm going to start the poll, and I am not able to do the poll. Yolando, could you start the poll?
Yes, it's launching right now.
Okay. I'd like to point out for the poll, all the data is anonymous. So as soon as we get the poll launched. Are we having trouble getting the poll?
No, the poll is available, Travis. You can't participate just because you're a co-host.
Okay.
The co-hosts are not able to participate.
So I unfortunately then cannot see the poll. So Yolando, could you, if you're seeing them, could you read out the questions and advance it?
Yeah, so right now it's just, we're hoping that you would tell us about yourself. So where do you live? And you have a few different municipalities to choose from, or regions. So Austin, Brighton, other Boston neighborhoods, Brookline, Cambridge, Newton, Somerville, Watertown, Metro West, and then there's also another box. What is your age is another option, another question that we have. So 0 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 59, 60 to 69, and 70 and higher. What is your annual household income? So there's a few different options there. So 0 to 19, almost 20,000, 20,000 to 34, 30, we could say 35,000, 35,000 to 55,000, 55,000 to 85,000, 85,000 to 140,000, and then 140,000 and more. And then how do you identify yourself in regards to race? We have Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, Asian, white, other, two or more. And then the last question is, I'm sorry, not the last question, but do you own a home? And then it's, I own a single family home. I own multi-family homes, triple decker as an example. I own condominium or townhome. I rent my home apartment, and then other. And then the last question is, what language do you speak at home? Spanish, English, Portuguese, a Chinese dialect, Haitian Creole, or other. And looks like we haven't had people plug in information onto the poll yet. Let me see what's going on with that.
It won't submit.
Okay. If we can't.
So you have to choose an option for all of them in order for it to submit. So if you don't choose an option, it won't submit anything.
This is Carl. I was able to answer the questions and submit the poll.
Okay, we'll give folks another minute to submit on the poll. Okay, so let's move on. Appreciate those who could answer the poll and in doing so. So I want to review the purpose of our study. The purpose of the West Station Area Transit Study is to provide really an objective evaluation of the strategies that could improve access to jobs and housing under different development futures, so around West Station. So again, we're looking at things that improve access. We're looking at different scenarios, whereas many times a study will look at one scenario or perhaps what we think is most likely to happen. The purpose of our study is to look at different futures. And then with that, then governments such as maybe the City of Boston, MassDOT, and others can then use the information from the different scenarios to then plan and implement the mobility improvements and other issues such as housing and economic development and land use and zoning around West Station. And then also MassDOT can then use we hope this information from the study to prioritize which investments are best for the West Station and the services that, that will go through West Station. At our last meeting, we talked about the desired outcomes. You could also think of these as goals of our study and what we hope for the West Station. So the desired outcomes include things such as improving transit access and reliability, reducing the number of car trips and our auto traffic in the area, encouraging the walkable development, better transit equity and job access for all, expanding housing opportunities, including affordable housing, and as well as bringing financial benefits and helping to meet our greenhouse gas emissions, our goals for the region. One thing you'll note there is we added access to workers as one of the things that we heard from November. And so we added that as one of our desired outcomes. We also note that these outcomes will be evaluated against the metrics in our study. And these are related to previous studies or other studies in the area, such as Go Boston, Metro Future, or Metro Common, our regional plan, as well as our regional equity goals. So what's happened? So since we last met with everyone in November, we've revised the desired outcomes, as I mentioned. We've also had the comment letter to MassDOT. As many of you know, MassDOT had the request for letters, and we included in our letter such as issues like we thought they should address additional multimodal analysis, looking at other options for both the construction impacts as well as for the West Station, and that they should also look at transit services that are consistent with the projections for the build options. Also, I want to note that we have been working with the City of Boston, especially on coordinating this study with the Western Avenue rezoning and the Alton-Brighton mobility study, as well as having discussions with MassDOT for their study on the I-90. And most importantly, since November, we've been working on the modeling tool with our consultant on to look at testing different alternatives for land development and transportation scenarios. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Tim Reardon, who will talk about the model and about how we're using the model for our study.
Thanks, Travis, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tim Reardon. I'm the Director of Data Services at MAPC, and I want to talk a little bit about the technical analysis that we've been doing, as well as the activity that we'll be asking you to do tonight to help guide the next phase of work. I want to acknowledge the work of my colleague, Connor Gately, who's here, and who will be helping to facilitate one of the breakout rooms, who's been really coordinating a lot of this technical work. And we've been working with a consultant called Renaissance Planning Group at Transportation Planning Consultant on a new modeling tool called the Enhanced Multimodal Accessibility Modeling Tool. And the reason that we're doing this is because, as many of you may know, the regional transportation model that's used for the I-90 planning and a lot of the environmental permitting is very comprehensive and covers the entire region, and is includes many different aspects, but it is difficult to use for quick scenario modeling or for testing out lots of different alternatives rapidly. And so what we've been doing is developing a model that allows us to explore a range of different scenarios and then identify some of the most promising solutions that could be advanced further for more to look at in a more detail by our colleagues over at the Central Transportation Planning staff. So this new modeling tool that we've been working on will help us to compare future transit services, new connections, and active transportation facilities, and how they will enable folks to have better access to jobs and other destinations. With it, we can test out the interaction between land use and transportation options, because we know that travel demand isn't only a matter of what trains or buses or bike paths are available, but also where people live, where they work, and where they want to recreate. We can assess the impact of specific policies and pricing and service by looking at how changes in the cost of parking or the cost of transit fares might affect transit use and other things. And then we'll be able to score each one of the scenarios that we test out based on specified outcomes and metrics, which I'll talk about shortly. And with this, we'll be able to identify some of the most promising transportation options that should be advanced for further analysis, as well as the land use development scenarios that are really most supportive of sustainable transportation. And all of this is based on the premise that the ease of access, that is how long it takes and how much it costs to get somewhere, influences whether people are choosing to drive, to take transit, to walk or bike, or to go by other modes. So, and I want to sort of walk through that last last point there with a slide and a chart. So this, the map on the left shows accessibility to jobs by transit for the Metro Boston region. And the areas that are in yellow are those where someone who is in one of those areas, living in one of those areas, can reach the greatest number of jobs by transit in the shortest amount of time. And as you go out to the greens and dark blues, the number of jobs that can be accessed in a reasonable amount of time by transit decreases. And you can see how those, the colors on the map and the patterns on the map follow the rapid transit lines, and even to some extent, the commuter rail lines, because those provide access to a lot of jobs in the inner core. And the chart on the right shows how the accessibility to jobs by transit also correlates with how people get to work. And so the horizontal line there basically correlates to corresponds to the colors on the map, the number of jobs accessible via transit. And then the vertical axis shows the share of commutes that are taken by a mode other than driving. So that could be transit, it could be walking or biking. And you can see that as people have access to more jobs via transit, they're more likely to take transit to get to work. And so the model is sort of premised on this. And so as new transit services or improved transit services or improved bicycle and pedestrian connections allow people to get to more opportunities in a shorter amount of time and with less cost, we'll see it'll be more likely that those folks will be taking transit or walking or biking to get where they need to go. And this is a very simplified representation of the assumptions that underlie this model. Now, a few details about what we're talking about here. Number one, I want to make sure that folks know that we're accounting for development scenarios immediately in the West Station area and the land that Harvard owns, but we're also accounting for anticipated development all throughout Allston, Brighton, and really all across the region. So we're not looking at this in a bubble, but rather looking at the interactions between this and all the other development that's planned throughout the city and throughout the region. We'll incorporate information from the Western Avenue Corridor Study as it becomes available, which the City of Boston Planning and Development Agency is doing now. The baseline scenario that we've been looking at, which is the same assumptions that went into the scoping document for the final environmental impact report for the interchange, assumes about 3.7 million square feet of development at Allston Landing South, or that immediate, Beacon Park Yards, as some people call it, by 2040, but a full build, like basically full build out of that area of over 11 million square feet. But that would take much more time than the 8 years after the highway interchange is done between then and 2040. So that's a 20 or 30 year build out horizon. A couple of caveats are for simplicity's sake, our analysis is limited to the weekday morning rush hour, basically between 6 and 9 a.m. We know there's lots of travel that happens at other times and lots of other trips that happen at other times, but we need to make some choices about how to focus the model in order to make it manageable. We're looking at travel really at the census block level for a 3 to 4 mile radius around West Station, and then for larger, what are called transportation analysis zones for the rest of the region. A couple of things we aren't able to account for in this particular model is transit capacity. Is there going to be any room to get on the bus or the train when it shows up? We haven't yet incorporated ride-hailing services such as Uber and Lyft, or micromobility such as scooters, although we plan to do that. And then we haven't been able to consider how the COVID crisis may affect transportation demand and land use patterns over a 20-year time period between now and 2040. And certainly that's on our mind. And you may have ideas about how we should think about that in this effort. And we'd like to hear those, but it's something I think none of us in the planning field have been able to incorporate yet. Just trying to go to the next slide here. So the inputs that we put into the model are the total amount of development that's in the West Station area, and again, all throughout the region. The mix of uses, so how much housing, how much office, how much retail, the number of affordable housing units, how much parking is available for people who are living in the West Station area, and therefore how many cars do they own, how much does that cost, and then also parking costs at the West Station area and employment sites really throughout the inner core. And then on the transit side, the assumptions really relate to the frequency and speed of existing transit service, the routes and the frequency and speed of new transit service, and how much that costs, and how much how it compares to transit. When we're done running these the scenarios, we're going to evaluate them on a variety of different metrics. I've listed just a sample here, but we're going to look at things like how many auto trips per day are coming to or from the station area, how many miles traveled is that, and how much greenhouse gas emissions are produced by people who are driving to or from the area, how much active transportation, walking or biking, is there to or from the area, how many jobs can people who are living there access, especially low-income folks who are living in the West Station area, and can they access appropriate jobs? What's the accessibility to workers for employers who are living there, especially via transit? How many transit riders might there be? And how many affordable housing units are being built? And what's the opportunity? How is it helping to address? How is the development in this area helping to address the region's housing crunch? We've already started running some preliminary scenarios. We don't have any results for you tonight, but those are underway. We're looking at what you have a baseline scenario that's based on the FEIR assumptions, but we're also looking at already looking at issues such as alternatives such as what if the development achieved those full build levels of over 11 million square feet. And also, what if the frequency of commuter rail service was 15 minutes both ways, or what if there was a 20% reduction in travel time for buses? So we're starting to explore some of these things. But what we want to do, these are just to test it out, and what we want to do tonight is really hear from you about what you kinds of scenarios you think we should explore. So we know that through this process, there have been many transit connections and services that have already been identified. Certainly one of the most prominent would be frequent transit service from West Station to Kendall Square and North Station over the Grand Junction. Also a Grand Junction pedestrian or bike path through the same route, bus rapid transit network connecting the area. And then also we've talked with folks about development and policy, sort of what ifs. What if there were a much, the affordable housing in the area were much higher than the standard inclusionary development policy, or if there were more homes than employment. How much does parking and transit cost? And then what if development was a lot slower? So the question for tonight is, what land use and transportation futures do you want us to explore in this process? And we'll do that in a breakout rooms, as Travis mentioned, and we'll be asking you about key trip origins and destinations. That is, what are the places that people need to be coming from and going to from West Station? We've got some ideas on that based on the model, but you might tell us what you think is important. We want to hear about improvements to existing transit and active transportation connections, and then also new routes and services, and also to hear from you your ideas about land use development and other parking policies, all of which we can use. We'll sort of synthesize all that and do some more analysis and more models. But first, I want to take a pause and see if there's any questions based on what we've talked about so far, and then we'll give you a little more detail about the breakout rooms and let you go. So why don't I take a look at the chat room. If you have any questions that you wanna ask us, just click that chat button down at the bottom and put them in there. One question is, why is ride hailing included in transit? It is not. We would consider that to be an auto mode, and as I mentioned, we are not quite there where we can incorporate that into the model. And another question is whether we're looking at whether spaces include electric vehicle recharging. That would change the number of car owners who might want to park because they could recharge their electric vehicle. We are not looking right now. Again, we have to simplify a few things for this model, so we're not making any big assumptions about electric vehicle ownership here. Another question is, where did the total square feet of development come from? That was analysis that MAPC conducted in partnership with the City of Boston, MassDOT, and Harvard University, looking at comparable development areas and making some assumptions about the density of development on Beacon Park Yards or Alston Landing South for purposes of the final environmental impact report. And I'll just note that land use scenario that we created for the FEIR did assume robust transit service in the area. Both the level of development and the level of car ownership that was assumed in those forecasts were predicated on the idea that it was a transit-rich area with frequent commuter rail service and frequent connecting bus service. Now, we weren't specific about what that was, but that was a really important underlying assumption there. Another comment here about important public transit bus connections, which is a great suggestion that you can talk about in the breakout room. And is there a plan for a locked bike cage with entry via T-Pass? I can't say that we are at that level of detail in this particular study. So in the interest of time, I want to move to talk a little bit about what you'll see in the breakout rooms. My colleague Annabelle has prepared a map for you, an interactive map that your facilitators will use to help solicit questions and orient you to the area and really be able to mark this up. I want you to think about the breakout rooms here like you were sitting around a table and we had a bunch of maps rolled out on the table, and there was a scribe with a Sharpie who you could point to something on the map and say, I think this is an important connection or an important destination. And we'll mark it up there. TA lines, anticipated development in the area where we have dedicated facilities, and then we've also already mapped out on the map some of the previously identified connections that I talked about, the Grand Junction connection, as well as bus rapid transit connections. But what we want you to do is tell us, basically, make suggestions on how we should mark up this map, what places and connections are important. And your facilitator will be able to draw lines, to circle areas, to put dots on the map and take your notes. And then we can compile all those. On the website tomorrow, there'll also be a link where folks can see the map themselves and make their own markups and provide their own contribution that way. So the 4 questions we want you to address, and you'll have a little, just about 30 minutes to do that if I can get through this quickly, are what are the important origins and destinations that people will need to connect to via West Station, that is to or from or through West Station. What existing transit routes need improvements and what services are needed to increase the range of transit access to and from West Station. What active transportation routes need to be improved or created. And then what other development options or zoning standards, parking requirements, facilities such as EV charging or bike cages, what other policies should we model and evaluate? I can't promise that we'll be able to sort of model all of them, but we can certainly account for them as important considerations in the development of this area. I want to check and see if there's any other questions here that we need to address beforehand. I think important comments in the chat box, but in the interest of time, I'm going to ask my colleague Elise to send us all to the breakout rooms, and we'll have just about 30 minutes. You'll see some warnings come up at 10 minutes and then 5 minutes. Please do try to get through all 4 questions because they're all important. I know a lot of folks are going to want to talk about the transit connections piece, but it's also important for folks to talk about what gets built, how it gets built, and who lives there. So we'll let you go, and we will see you all in about 30 minutes for the report out.
Let me just point out that I think there'll be a prompt for you to join a breakout room. Please click on that join, and that'll take you to the breakout room. All right, so everyone, I hope it was a productive session. It sounds like it was really good, and so we extended it a few minutes. So thanks. So in the next, we have just a few minutes, and I'm going to ask a couple people to report out maybe what they discussed in their group. So let me just call on. So Eric, can you tell us maybe 60 seconds, like a couple points that was discussed in your group?
Sure. So we talked a lot about some of the key origins and destinations being people who live in Allston, both now and in the future, getting to downtown Boston, folks from Metro West, from the Newton area, getting over to Cambridge, and those north-south connections, people living in Cambridge, Harvard Square, getting down to Longwood. We also talked a bit about how do we think about job access, particularly for lower income people into this area. So maybe even connections from other neighborhoods of Boston and Chelsea and other communities of color to access this area. Major, kind of connections were really more service on the existing, commuter rail corridor, the Grand Junction, and then buses north-south in dedicated lanes. We talked about a few different kind of land use thoughts. One being that the area immediately to the south of the station, Alston Village area, has really the potential to change over quickly as the development happens and as sort of more speculation occurs. And that could be a scenario where we look at a lot more growth happening kind of there, and even Babcock Street in Brookline, and some of the growth happening faster in that. So that was about 60 seconds, a few other things, but very high level.
Okay, thanks. I'm gonna call on Yolando, your group.
Great, thank you. Yeah, my group definitely highlighted some similar things that Eric's group did. They mentioned the Grand Junction, also the Route 66 bus that goes through the area, and it was also flagged that there's a lot of delivery vehicles that are circling certain streets in that area, and that we should just look at like how to mitigate that, or how West Station can support with that. Job centers was something that folks highlighted, both MIT and Harvard. How could we move people around there better? Harvard Square, Kendall, and also like research campus around the area. So
Great.
similar things to what Eric's group said, but folks decided to go a little bit, went into some detail about some things that they're interested in.
Great. And just I want to mention, I'll do it here. So note takers, the ones who are working on taking the notes on the screen, please download and save your work, right? If you haven't done so already. So it's just a little reminder for them. So I think, Tim, go ahead and talk about like your group, maybe a couple points. Unmute yourself.
Yep, thanks, Travis. We talked about some of the similar things that Eric did. I think one of the participants brought up the need to connect not just to Kendall Square, but to the whole lower Mystic area beyond that, where there's a tremendous development potential, and MAPC has already been working with Boston, Somerville, and Everett on looking at development options there and connecting all of the development opportunity in the lower Mystic area to West Station would be important to create economic options and also more options for employers who might not need to be right there next to all the Harvard facilities. Heard a lot about the need for really frequent transit service to and from the area. And then on the development side, at the very end, we talked a little bit about sort of the street design in West Station area, actually in Alston Landing South, and heard some concerns about the plans for 4 and 6 lane roadways and the need for the roadways in the development site to be designed like local roads that are pedestrian friendly.
Great. So in the time, I think if we could answer a couple questions, and maybe Tim, you could help address some of these, but there was a question about what are the land uses in the 3.7 million square feet?
Sure. Those are the assumptions that went into the FEIR, and we can make different assumptions for different scenarios in this project, but that was about 35 to 40% residential and a similar amount office, and then a mix of research and development and other retail, entertainment, and cultural space in the remainder of that. And those percentages are really for the full 12 million square feet. I can't recall exactly which. I think the 3.7 might be a little more weighted towards residential development in that first phases.
Okay. We also had a question in the chat that says modeling is difficult, but focusing on like where people live and work are probably on those work trips. Ignores the needs of other trips like childcare and daycare, grocery stores, and other things. I just wonder if there's how do we try to address those? Maybe not in this study, but how do we address that in other modeling, Tim?
That's an important point. I mean, one of the metrics which we didn't talk about is how many of the trips are what we call internal capture. Like how many uses and activities can people do without necessarily having to get in a car or even get on a bus or a train to go somewhere? So is there a supermarket, a daycare, a drugstore, all the things that we need, a lot of the things that don't even exist in a seaport? Will the neighborhood be built in such a way that it provides all those uses? So some of those are transportation issues and some of them are also land use issues. And I think that's an important consideration there. I did see this question before we started, and I would say if folks want to identify, like we do want to hear that, and if there are important places that people need to get to for non-work trips, they should provide that, and they can provide that input, and we'll account for that. Certainly, one of the things that we heard in our session was just the need to connect to the river for recreational purposes and for accessing that incredible open space up and down the Charles. So those are very important, and the quantitative modeling will focus on one narrow slice, but the plan and the recommendations will cover lots of other pieces of making a real complete neighborhood in this area that's connected to the rest of the region.
I take your point about childcare, and one of my frustrations when we talk about development in Alston Brighton is we don't
That's a great point. Thank you, Councillor.
So at the interest of time, it's 6:15, and we talked about getting everyone out of here at around 6:15. I see there's some other questions in the chat. We can certainly address those in our write-up. And I want to point out that, you know, there was a lot of conversation in our group and in all the groups. And one of the things we want to do is we're going to try to capture that and then summarize it and get it posted on the website. And as Tim mentioned earlier, we're going to try to post the link to the Mapbox tool that was used in this breakout groups. And you could go in and you could share that link with others, and you could put down your own options and look at that and then get that information to us. So in terms of what happens next, as you can see on this schedule, so where we are is we're in this sort of springs area of 2020. We had the meeting that today was talking about scenarios. From that, we're going to develop additional land use and transportation scenarios, taking the information that you've given us. We're going to then test and evaluate those scenarios with the modeling tool, and then we'll come back in the late summer or fall to talk about what the final analysis and recommendations are. And that's when we'll have another meeting, and we'll reach out to you again. It could be maybe another virtual meeting like this, or it might be something in person, maybe in Alston Brighton. So again, please visit our website. This is where we'll be posting updates on the study, where we'll be posting a summary of this meeting. And again, we're putting that link up. And this is, again, if you have any questions, my email address is here. You can send a message to us on the website, and you can sign up for us. I think one of the things that you know, we want to make sure you do is that you're up to date, especially as we move forward with the study. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for giving us, or for helping us on this, and for participating in our first time of doing this. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you again.